So with almost 30 years into democracy, government is still battling to address many of the challenges facing people. Yesterday, the EFF led a national shutdown over the high unemployment rate, load shedding, and a whole range of other issues, saying President Cyril Ramaphosa should step down as he's failed the country. For more on the role of active citizenry in this day and age, we're joined by a former leader of the United Democratic Front, Ebrahim Rasool, joins us via our video link this morning. Ebrahim, it's great to see you. Thanks very much indeed for coming on. I'm sure you saw the EFF's protest action unfolding in various parts of the country. Whether it was a success or not is a discussion for another day. But, you know, many analysts have weighed in and said there is certainly a role for a protest of this kind, given the various challenges that we face in South Africa today. In your leadership role with the UDF, what parallels can you draw from the position South Africa was in back then and what you were fighting for, and where we find ourselves today?
Look, good morning and happy Human Rights Day, if we can call it that. But let me say that the most important difference between struggle as a liberation movement and struggle today within a democratic South Africa is the issue of the legitimacy of those who struggle against. In our days, it was very clear that the apartheid state had no moral legitimacy, no political legitimacy. The enemy was clear, it wore a uniform, it was identifiable, and it had key points that you could really attack, if I could put it like that. Whereas today, the government against whom there was protest is a legitimate government. It has a majority. It is not necessarily competent. It has proven at points to be corrupt. But the fact of the matter is it an enemy or is it a rival for power? And so, as Nelson Mandela would have said, any government, his government he described as a temporary majority, meaning that those who don't like it need to replace it, need to win elections and win the popular support of people. And so legitimacy is the most important point, and that then has a second thing. How do you describe yourself? We described ourselves as part of a liberation movement, wanting to replace the government and not to outvote it because we did not have the vote. Today you can't call yourself a liberation movement, but you could be watchdogs for particular interests and for particular causes, and therefore you must have active citizenry when there are aberrations in the government and when they veer, of course, such as with service delivery and electricity supply, and certainly with regard to the issues of corruption. If we don't have those watchdogs, we will not be even alert to the idea sometimes that there are problems. But you are not a liberation movement. You are a movement that draws attention. You're a watchdog movement over society and over governments.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, that's such an excellent way of describing it. And, you know, the fact that the enemy back during the apartheid days, that the enemy was clear, as you say, that there was an illegitimate government that we were fighting against at the time. That's the biggest issue, right? Because people may have wanted to join the EFF march yesterday for exactly the reasons outlined by Julius Malema. The corruption issue, unemployment numbers, continuous load shedding. But perhaps they were struggling with, what does that mean in terms of where I'm aligning myself?
You see, that's exactly it, because we fought, for example, for the ungovernability of apartheid. But we were also very clear that we did not want to destroy what we wanted to inherit. We did not want a wasteland, and therefore sometimes a protest can be inappropriate because a firefighter does not rush to the scene of the fire, whether it is corruption, whether it is load shedding. You don't rush to the scene of the fire with petrol. You rush with the antidote to the fire, which could be water or a fire extinguisher. And so that is what has put off a lot of people who share the grievance, but don't trust the methodology and certainly don't trust the agenda of the leadership.
Right.
And that, I think, it is not as if South Africans are happy with load shedding or corruption or crime. They are unhappy, but they don't want to follow a firefighter that rushes to the fire with petrol.
Yeah, yeah. It makes it even more difficult then, I suppose, today, to rally together as a country, as you did, as part of the UDF, and as the people in Sharpeville did on this day in 1960. It was so clear there what we were all rallying together against. Today, how do we get back that kind of active citizenry? Is it even possible, given everything you've outlined?
I think that it is possible and it is necessary to have active citizenry, because the state today and the nation today is not where we would have wanted it. We have been, I think, misled. I think we have been led by an incompetence, and therefore, if we don't have active citizenry, we will not have the wherewithal to recover from it and to hold the government to account, or even to replace the government when it comes to elections. And therefore, we need active citizenry. But what we have would be political parties who have no confidence in their ability to win the election, and therefore either take a form of lawfare to win through the courts what they lose in the politics and in parliament, or to go to mass action because they don't have any action within parliament, and when they can hold power accountable, they do all kinds of stunts. And so that is the dilemma for South Africans, that active citizenry can't be the substitute for legitimate political activity, but active citizenry must have, as we saw, for example, in the removal of President Zuma, we just saw a spontaneous act of citizenry which was well led on the one hand. We were not asking people to be adventurous, to destroy the infrastructure and to place their lives at risk, but certainly in the same way that the UDF cared for the people that they were mobilizing and did not necessarily wantonly put them in danger, and had marshals to mediate between us and the police, etc., rather than all of us being on our own. People need to know that the leaders of active citizenry are responsible citizens who have the whole view of society and are not just painting in one corner of the puzzle.
Yeah, and are not just sort of politicking for the sake of it. You talk about this issue that the leader who is sort of leading a protest like the one that Julius Malema led yesterday, the same can be said for opposition politics in general. There's a lot of drama, there's a lot of politicking. We just need to look at the coalition politics taking place in our councils, particularly in Tshwane and in Johannesburg, if I think of Gauteng here. The fact that we can't get our acts together insofar as opposition government, opposition parties, coalition politics is concerned, the government of the day benefits from that, surely.
No, absolutely. And that, I think, is then a denial of the rights of people to be heard because they are not being well led. I can remember I spent about 2 years as leader of the opposition in the Western Cape before we became the government as the ANC. And we became the government because we placed ourselves creatively and peacefully at the center of all the things that bother people. That when, for example, people were given eviction notices, the famed pink slips by the DA government in the Western Cape, we brought all of the people with pink slips together across racial divides, and we understood the common denominator was that not everyone had a sense for political or even violent confrontation, but they wanted to register, and we did that. When hairdressers refused to cut the hair of black and colored people, we were able to queue outside that in the most creative way, as would be led by Nelson Mandela or Martin Luther King Jr. in the USA, and dramatized their plight so that active citizenry taught a broader lesson and wasn't an act on its own. And that was how we eked away at the electoral strength of the current government then, the DA, and we became the government and replaced them within 2 years. Now that, I think, is a creativity that is absent from the politics, and it does a disservice to the citizens who have legitimate grievances.
Yeah, absolutely. Ebrahim, what happens now? Because there is a sense, and you'll tell me whether you agree with me on this, there is a sense that people are losing hope in South Africa in many ways. Our economy is buckling, our unemployment numbers are sky high. If we haven't lost hope yet, that moment is surely closer than we'd want.
I think that we should never have been in this position of despair. Not because times are tougher today than they were during apartheid and the times. During our times, 90% of citizens did not even have electricity connected, let alone losing electricity for 8 to 12 hours a day. So there's no comparison between what we are going through today and what we went through. The difference was that we didn't expect anything from the government then, and we only needed to remove the government then. The problem today is that we have a government that is supposed to be in the interest of the people, but we have these problems. And so the loss of hope, the loss of belief, and increasing the loss of participation is the most dangerous threat to the achievement of democracy and human rights that we do have. The government still has the legitimacy, and so there are elections that sorts out who would be the government, and therefore we need creative ways to do it. But most importantly, a former liberation movement that is the government today needs to not be tone deaf. They need to show urgency. They cannot be technocratic only. They have to communicate that they are large and in charge, and that they are all the day actively working. You cannot have aberrations such as ostentation by government while there's suffering by people, because we were all equal as leaders of the liberation movement when we were fighting this evil. We did not come from our palaces to the protest grounds. I think, secondly, we must show an intolerance of aberration within our ranks. If there's even someone with a hint of corruption, we must not have that person as part of the solution. We must show that our distaste for the problems that we are facing starts with us. And if we show a tolerance inside, then they will not trust us to show a tolerance outside. We must have no holy cows within our ranks of untouchable leaders. If we are able to show that no leader is untouchable within, then people will trust us that when there is a criminal outside terrorizing and bullying communities, that we will have an intolerance for that person, rather than a tolerance inside and no appetite to fight outside. Our people need basic safety, and therefore I think we need to mobilize communities again. That's also active citizenry. We can't outsource all our problems to the state. We also have an active citizenry where people patrol their streets and government provides the wherewithal, the walkie-talkies, the bibs, the support from the police station, the assistance from the police themselves in order to do it. So we've got to redefine also the notion of active citizenry as a way to mobilize against despair as we mobilize against the problems in our society.
Absolutely. Ebrahim Rasool, thank you so much for that incredible insight there. He's a former leader of the United Democratic Front Forum. Ebrahim, let me thank you for your time this morning, particularly salient points on this Human Rights Day.